Yo, check this out. Ain't seen that in Call of Duty, baby. Final Fantasy Tactics, a game where you jump 30 feet in the air to pummel a priest. Or it would have been, but as they say, no plan survives contact with the enemy. The enemy is the market. If you clicked on this, you probably understand that Final Fantasy Tactics, the first, is a gaming landmark, very important title, extremely innovative and influential. Why yes, I'm feverishly pushing down on a hatch labeled Tactics Ogre fans right now. Why do you ask? Tactics is a game of extremes in many ways, especially considering how the series changed, but no other in the lineage has lived as loud and long as FFT. And I have my own history to consider. I started with FFTA at 12, dropped an Omega cringe video on it years ago, played the sequel through high school, and only got to FFT in my 20s. It's one of the series I'm most attached to, you know, too busy writing out character builds to pay attention in class. This series and my thoughts on it have done full revolutions over many years, and it's time I wrote it out. So, let me tell you a tale. Tactics, a time for kill. You can find FFT on the original hardware, and mostly digitally in the War of the Lions port with its enhanced localization and various editions. Both are good, but I've chosen to play an alternative version of War of the Lions, not linked in the description, which, overall, clears up a lot of the little issues the game is known for. Don't worry, I'll be going into them anyway, and you might think it's telling that I picked a version with expedited grinding, but no, it was for science. Mostly. Here's the thing. I distinctly remember playing for 2 hours and quitting out of the original. I remember going back in, playing through, and writing up a totally awful polemic about the experience later on. It's one of my original unpublished scripts, and thank God for that. Despite that glowing history, time, context, and a full new playthrough turned this game into an easy top 20, at least.
I don't know, I only like 3D current-gen games.
You know, I can't think of another video game that lets you inflict atheist on people, okay? Tactics good. Yes, it does stupid crap, stuff I can hardly believe, but what you take away from the game is so much more than the low points. I have to call it a classic, but don't take my word for it, take my word from 5 years ago for it.
Okay, all we have to do is kill these kids.
You know, that old localization wasn't great, but it was punchy. Blame yourself or God. Oh God, they're coming! Kill these kids! And that only spiced a visually interesting, politically sophisticated tale of ambition and strife. No script error can undo the stuff the game showed you. And the gameplay is extremely noteworthy, but let's set the base. FFT's story shot far beyond what many of its contemporaries dared to do. In 1997, stripped of bells, whistles, and nouns, the story's about a young noble and his friend of ignoble birth. How the two interface with a system dedicated to human exploitation. How they react when their reality, their shared lot in life, is understood. How their diverging paths dovetail as they pursue similar goals through differing means. And ultimately, how their efforts are rewarded. It was shockingly adult, not because of the violence, but rather how it delivered a narrative about recognizing privilege and challenging societally imposed hierarchies, in a game where everybody's looking like this. Yeah, the stuffed doll brigade just told you to check your privilege. Hot to it, son! To draw an example, the protag, Ramza Beowulf here, starts the game lamenting why criminals would choose to be criminals, like... they'd still be alive if they weren't thugs. But as the events unravel and the lot of the common folk becomes starkly visible, Ramza realizes when Delita's sister is killed as a hostage of the rebel faction by the crown that he contributed to her death. His inaction, inability to process how the nobility and common folk fit into a framework of oppressor and oppressed, means that he was a useful pawn for the ruling class, a perpetuator of the status quo. You know, a lot of game writing doesn't have a lot of merit, partly because of the reality of game dev. But, and that's to say nothing of the rewritten localization in War of the Lions, where the original was sharp and, full of interesting new applications of the English language. The Waddle script is written in an elevated antiquarian style, resembling Shakespeare at times, and these lines, man, please drop quotes in the comments, but some of my favorites are here. A new justice is born and dies on the lips of each man who would pronounce it. A man does not eat an omelet without breaking eggs. Blood is the price of progress. It is the ink in which history's pages are writ. Do you even... Oh my It's poetic, brazen, so good. And so many great quotes get to exist because so many high-profile figures of varying motivations come into direct conflict throughout the war that underpins the plot. FFT is primed for a strong war story, so the game ponies up the war, or tactics in this case. Now I know a YouTube audience loves game mechanics. Ramza does too. Just look. He can hardly contain himself. You've seen the gameplay before. Small squads of various classes swing steel and sling spells. You level up and unlock new abilities throughout the game, but there's a lot going on that isn't communicated at a glance. Battlefields are sometimes built high, but are pretty small overall. Opposing forces clash in a couple moves, often less. Volatility is high, that is, damage is high, and many things from status ailments to revival spells miss more than they probably should. This issue is compounded by the Zodiac system I'll mention later, but taken in broad strokes, the encounters are quick, dangerous, and dramatic. There's a lot of reversal potential in the moment-to-moment gameplay. All it really takes to panic the player is a downed unit and a missed revival spell. The high reversal potential often creates emergent strategy, where the flow of the game isn't always decided by the player's pre-built loadouts, but often by what happens in a given game. That might sound obvious, but it's not the case for many SRPGs, and even the sequels. In short, FFT feels very alive. That said, the RPG, the characters you build, do matter a lot, so let's not downplay it. I tend to play these games differently than what I've heard from other people. I like the generic units a lot. I like being able to build my guys, you know? Celebrate that uniqueness. I've heard other people focus on plot characters, but you lose one of the most engaging aspects of the series if you go too hard. There's a lot of plot characters on offer, and FFT has the smallest average squad sizes of the series. At least you're closer to reenacting the plot, but you're gonna get the cutscenes anyway. Whatever. The version of the game I'm playing allowed for innate job point plus, a skill which made grinding less of a chore. The original had that problem, right? If you really wanted to grind, you first needed the JP plus ability from the Squire set to efficiently farm points, which is dumb. The game would be better served with even less grinding than what I put myself through this time, because there's a lot of really cool stuff hidden away in the different job move pools, but let's acknowledge it because I don't often hear it. Grinding is almost totally unnecessary with attention to tactics, defensive play, and picking efficient utility classes. The early unlockable jobs stay relevant, right? The base melee job, the Squire, has always useful buffs. The base magic job, the Chemist, can and should be used from start to finish. I've personally run the early unlockable black and white mages in both my FFT playthroughs, and both knights and monks, the early melee unlockable classes, also have useful qualities and utility. You don't have to plumb the depths to beat the game, it just makes it easier. But you can turn Ramza into a highly mobile, gravity-defying, blood-hungering punch monk, you know, if you wanted to. There's all kinds of crazy combos, like the super gigabrain murder math wizard, but even simple stuff will get the job done. Damn, FFT really out here validating the math kid. Granted, strategy, tactics, this idea that the player is a scheming genius is kind of silly. A lot of the endgame comes down to nuking, just find the biggest damage and deal it. Because many classes are cute, many jobs have fun abilities, but a lot of the game is generally unbalanced, at least the base versions, right? If the goal becomes kill the boss character, which really is most of the endgame, and the edgiest guy in the game literally teleports and nothing personnel kids you with a katana, the goal isn't hold hands and sing a healing kumbaya, it's kill ASAP, and a lot of jobs just can't step to that. Now, in my usual eye-rolling bid to feign intelligence, I've decided to talk about the gameplay's major issues and stumbling blocks for newer players. Quality of life improvements were made in the port, but if you're coming from one of the sequels, you might be surprised to learn that you need individual characters to learn how to use the items you buy in the shop, like buy the ability to use antidotes with job points, which is crazy to me, and means one character has the item skill in my party and only one. Dang, too dumb to drink. You hate to see it. Stats are mostly related to your equipment. It's really important to equip the highest quality gear when you can, so you can tack 40 hit points onto your life bar here and there. It makes sense. Weird they didn't just make armor good for armor rating, and it means item-breaking skills have tactical value. It just seems bizarre to tie HP to armor. Means mages get one-shot, properly one-shot, a lot more than you'd like. I normally don't talk about small stuff like this, but it'll tie into the sequel discussion. Another small thing, but newer players will probably be put off by casting times. Like in the sequels, you pick a spell and do it, as one does, but in FFT, you have to pick the prime delivery option and hope it goes off when you want it to, or read up on the count system and do the legwork.
As if.
Ooh, and don't forget, no takebacks. If you say yes to that end-user license agreement to move, it's done. You've moved. Don't you dare visually plan a strategy, you dumb I didn't mention permadeath, but that's there. I actually like that aspect. Better pack some feathers, bucko. I have a hard time understanding why certain classes, Archer and Dragoon, have aim 1 to 8 and jump whatever, respectively, as the near entirety of their skill trees. It's too often that a whole class is full of trash skills, and Waddle was an opportunity to fix some of these. Generally, they weren't. The special version I'm on consolidated a lot of these bulk skills, so you don't have to save up for the final version while never buying any skills for your shiny job. Touched up others, but didn't break any ground. In the base game, many additional characters are ridiculously powerful, notably Orlando, who I've never failed to use and who carries the endgame by himself. There's a broader discussion here involving jobs and even encounter design, but the gist is, balance isn't great and feels like a total afterthought by the endgame. In fact, the version I'm on hot-fixed the issue by nerfing Orlando and over-leveling many endgame battles, and it changes almost nothing. Granted, it wasn't a full balance patch, it's just crazy how little the game asks the player by then. And while the endgame is rife with idiotic bosses running into nukes, the early game is equally rife with annoying AI-controlled allies hurling themselves into certain death for no apparent reason. You know it's bad when the ranged gunman runs headlong into the opposition and the mission ends if they die, in a game where dying is 3 hits away. Thankfully, the enhanced version lets me control the AI, and it's not half bad. And to give some credit to the ally computer, the enemy AI is also terrible. I actually almost lost this early fight on screen, but the boss, instead of killing me easily, plunged into the water where they can't act, so I stole all the treasure and domed him with lightning. Holy crap, you jumped in the water, you bozo! Also, the early game's just way harder than most of the rest of it. You know, AI problems, competitive enemies, few skills, randomly dying in random encounters. It's a grinder until you learn, but nothing really comes close to the Zodiac system. You see this? You're looking at this? You're not looking at this. Nope. I'm telling you now, it's like learning your favorite Pokemons in PU tier. Sorry, unranked tier because it sucks. Don't do it to yourself. But I will tell you it impacts your compatibility with other units, even though that's not real, periodic table true, etc. So sometimes you just can't land revivals or buffs or heals on your allies, and that's usually why. Stellar. I don't bust the term out often these days, but some of the battles are just bad game design. Like in this fight, the ally AI runs into death to get two-shot by the enemy assassins in the base game, and you just have to reset and try again because whoops, bad AI. And yeah, you know what? Let's talk Y-Graph. Are you kidding me? With this, Y-Graph is such an interesting, understandable antagonist, so naturally they gave him the old... If you ever see that prompt, turn and run to the nearest guidebook. This game will force you to save through a series of gauntlet-style battles, usually for significant plot battles, undoing a dynasty, that kind of thing. Only if you're on one save, like I was the first time I played, you can just lock yourself in an unwinnable save if you didn't pick a winning moveset against Y-Graph, which is really easy. The dude two-shots you reliably. There is no reaction. Angry Pog. Whatever. Pack saves. I wouldn't mind the back-to-back hard fights, and really only Y-Graph stands out to me looking back. It's just infuriatingly narrow design, where only a handful of things work and not every player is gonna queue in. Rest now, relic of a bygone era, and trouble the living no more. Even the story, for as much good as it does, fumbles the occasional scene. We get the dive in front of a bullet bit, which would be dramatic, but the magical MacGuffin shown to be exclusively demonic previously simply decides it's holy if the owner is good, so it resurrects the dead guy. Magic objects, creating annoying moments and questions in fiction since the entirety of known history. But I do love the story. Everyone walks away saying, that was cool. And I know it's been talked about to death, but that ending, though? Ramza left behind everything he was born into, made enemies of his family, the church, the state, all to find something worth fighting for, trying desperately to make amends for his complacency, protect those he could, and in the end he loses absolutely everything. His name dashed from history. He dies, or it's assumed he dies, a hero, protecting the people from the tyranny of a new status quo, and the threat of demonic annihilation. That part's a little unclear, though. Delita, on the other hand, Ramza's once friend turned Machiavellian power player, goes from lowborn to king in a handful of deadly political moves, his name lauded by history, and in the end, he's stabbed to death by the wife he's groomed to be his queen. And there it is. Did you get your end in all of this, Ramza? Or in the original, Ramza, what did you get? Nothing really hits the same after that. I've gone on a little too long. None of this is to say that FFT is a bad game, or a perfect product. It's partially the point of the video. There's all kinds of little things that pile up, even some huge glaring weaknesses, but you don't remember the frustration in retrospect. Tactics is full of dynamic, dramatic scenes and endless enjoyment, mountains of content that captured a strong fanbase for good reason. And among the games in the series, only one has inspired the level of interest that can turn an opinion, prompt another play, create endless patches and mods. FFT is a game as vital as its tight encounters. And to divulge more than I should, while writing joke moments for the script, I had almost twice as many for FFT than any of the sequels. FFT is not a funny game, and so it's an infinitely more remarkable game than its offspring. It's tough, but I promise it's worth it. Okay, this is one hell of a change. We got pizza cutter sword, joint plates. We got the king of all rat tails. Been collecting smartphones, I see. You know, the sequel, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance on the GBA, is not a bad game. If anything, it's really good, but propping it up next to its forebear does nothing for it, and that's what we're here to do. Full disclosure, this was my favorite game until I developed taste, and it's my childhood comfort game. I love it a lot, but as some guy said, every road is a turning. That's the way you keep learning. The story's nothing to talk about, really, and yet somehow one of the only things that still gets talked about. The premise is a couple of kids hate their lives for some reasons, some slightly better than others, and through a magic book, the world transforms to meet the whims of the kid with the book. It gets accused of kidification, which I once defended because it's just playing in the snow. And realistically, it's a Game Boy game. I don't think the political angle would be appropriate for kids, but I can't even imagine what it's like being an old fan of the first and watching this come out in real time, waiting for a true sequel. And I'll get into it more later, but it really does feel sort of small by comparison. To be fair, the kid's issues aren't nothing. The protag doesn't have a dad, or parental affection, I guess. His brother's in a wheelchair, presumably very ill. Ritz here got bullied for having naturally white hair and had to dye it every day. And Mute, the antagonist, has a dead mom and an alcoholic father, though they stripped that bit from the English release. There's a sick joke here about the English version carrying on the spirit of too dumb to drink, but I don't have the power. So the world changes overnight and a couple of things become really apparent. The stakes are low, because the world has game rules now, you know, you can't die if you pick a fight, and the mechanics support that vision of the world. It's kinda depressing. We've gone from a game with enormous stakes to soft in a single stroke. Mind you, it's a different team, but Matsuno still played a huge part in the development. It's unfortunate, but let's see the good it does. Well, it's a lot more colorful. There's a heap of races to pick units from, each with interesting and unique jobs, with the occasional shared profession. I like that it's committed to diversity, even if most of the jobs are bunk. Almost all of the skills are useless, minus 2 to 3 per job, and among those, almost all are outclassed by something or another. Several have the most abominable stat growths imaginable that can permanently damage your character's potential, but the lizards though! But the game's easy enough that it won't really matter. Who even cares? Right? I mean, it's true that the assassin has amazing growths, a lot of killer skills, pun extremely intended, access to multiple weapon types for utility, but to be fair, you have to work a little bit for it. And honestly, even if you're rocking the totally awful Banga Bishop, it will not stop you from winning. There's a clan system too. Marsh enters the fantasy world and dives right in. You can capture territory, and the pull to play the game comes from the promise of power. There's loads of quests at the pub, so much to unlock and churn through. You'll be too busy getting a handle on everything to worry about story progression. The RPG bits are significantly toned down this time. You can grind, but you shouldn't have to. Ever. You can efficiently acquire new abilities. You don't need a job point booster. You can unlock all jobs in a few hours if you're trying. Basically, the system was streamlined with one major difference. Skills are affixed to weapons and armor. Just equipping them lets you use the skill till it's mastered forever and you can equip something else. It's good for granting you immediate access on equip, but that's about it. Note that the RPG progression in this game is about drip feeding items to the player through quests. It doesn't really care what you use, and most nukes are saved for the very late game, so little game breaking will happen until the credits roll. The game was blasted for being easy, but it's deeper than that simple condemnation. FFTA is easy because, like the universe presented, the stakes are nil. You're playing a game. I used to appreciate the quality of life changes, and they are helpful, but I never want to go back and play this over the original. Kinda reminds me of the dumbed down fighting game paradox. But I'll give you some examples. There's no death. Outside of some very specific zones, your units are in no real danger. Spells go off instantly, no waiting around or pre-planning involved. You can take back as many moves as you want before hitting the action button, which is useful for visualizing a turn before it happens. Helpful spells like buffs and revives never miss. Your white mage cannot screw it up. When you kill dudes, you collect judge points that you can spend on combo moves or destructive totema powers that hit the full enemy team. The totema just totally trivialize battles if you go out of the way to collect enough judge points, and in case you don't know, accuracy is pretty iffy in this installment for melee attacks, worse than the last game, though blocking isn't a thing anymore. So using combo moves solo can give a character a free full damage unmissable hit, which is what I did with the main character a lot when I needed a kill confirm. Oh, and the stars themselves aren't conspiring to destroy you. So what does all that amount to? Nearly every battle is without drama, lacking the oh moment. Hardly any meaningful reactive play occurs, or emergent strategy. I bring my loadouts in, my loadouts perform, the battle is done. Jags, never dying, the new races and unique jobs for each, the relatively few story characters, the clan system and turf wars. Final Fantasy Tactics as a series, even including the first game, is more a game of making your party, getting nerdy about your team, than big brain strategy. FFTA just said it out loud and doubled down. At least you can play my favorite minigame, Bully Bows, by cornering a hapless AI and thunking fully drawn arrows point blank through their torso. But what if you couldn't play Bully Bows? Laws, the most criticized system of FFTA. There's a judge on every map, new laws every day. Breaking the law gets you a yellow card if you're lucky and a red card that sends you to jail. Really fun to game over like that. In theory, the law system's great because the game sorely needs the design of restriction to create emergent strategies, right? Otherwise, I'm just gonna do my normal thing every game. The problem is the list is once removed from gameplay, you're probably not paying attention, and it mostly results in resets rather than new strategies because the player can manipulate them. You can set and remove laws with law cards if you bother with that subsystem, but otherwise you can just kind of walk around the map till you get the laws you like. Without them, the game would be almost totally dedicated to quality of life, but it might just be a nothing game after a few runs of your favorite team's setup. Now again, using laws to your advantage is part of the point, not just restriction, and is perhaps the closest thing any of these games do that even resembles grand strategy, but I can say after at least 4 playthroughs that I almost never bothered, except in 2 instances. The infamous Ultima fight where turning charm illegal fries the AI like an egg in a pan, and making holy illegal for one of the bosses. That's it. I actually have more fun pitting my team against whatever the enemy team is to see who's strongest with all moves available. But that's the fantasy the game's selling. It wants you to be your own powerful, unique clan. So the law system has its good points, definitely comes from a good place, but mostly ends up glossed. An annoyance. With the gameplay out of the way, I want to get back into the story discussion because it isn't bad. For the most part. I still despise that any political narrative is dashed, except for one scene where judges overstep their bounds. Ezel, the anti-lawmaker, mentions that he's doing it to annoy the judges, because it's fun, not purely for the people, but to make a buck. Man, this game is the sequel to the original FFT. You teed yourself up, but the bat was foam. Anyway, for the bulk of the game, Marsh spends his time wanting to go home, seeking out the threads that bind the world and undoing them by force. He's got wants, motivations, and chooses to execute. The other characters while their time away enjoying the fantasy because the escape was their want, and their motivation largely ends at that. I really dislike some of the conclusions I came to in my older video. C'est la vie. Still, even today I get pissed off thinking about this game because it's the most unsatisfying thing in the world. Like, I'm so happy for Marsh, right? He goes through genuine character development while his friends languish, but at no point do I want to be Marsh. And I do get it. Mute conjuring this world as an illusion, and Marsh taking him to face his problems is effectively an act of compassion. Marsh ending the fabrication that cast Mute's bullies as zombies is an act of compassion. For all intents and purposes, Marsh is right. But I don't need to know that Marsh is right. Like, thank you, Melvin. Could you get back to me on 2+2? Thank God Marsh was right about Sid going sober in the epilogue. You know, at this point I've written about 6 large paragraphs and deleted every one of them, because I can't interface with this stuff in a satisfying way. The best way to think about the story is Marsh did the right thing, then stop thinking. Don't talk parameters, premises, anything. The game hardly explains the full extent of what happened to the world when it changed. Too many questions are lingering, and frankly, none of this is half as important or meaningful as what goes on in the previous installment. It's just not worth the time. So the story works, but it's uniquely interesting for putting the player in the role of the off button. If I had to pick a couple underrated things about this game, they'd be that Mute, despite doing awful things, is never treated as irredeemable, even shows up in the next game. And Lednar Twem, the terrible animated anime self-insert version of Mute looks like Marsh because Mute thinks that highly of the guy. It's very telling that he defends himself with the likeness of the person who's coming to shatter his dream world. Ultimately, it hits a nice payoff for a quiet story. With that, I probably won't be going back. Nice while it lasted, though. Oh, I'm getting hype. Oh, I'm getting hype. FFT in name alone, the final installment bears resemblance to the mechanics of the original, and that's about it. And it follows the last game nicely for the most part, but even then, it's a disturbing road to walk for a series that was once interested in examinations of privilege and social systems, even in small ways. FFTA 2 is good, but mostly because it's a master of what its predecessor started. Let's start with the protag, your boy Luso. He writes in library books. You, Luso.
Superfluous design, huh? I hope that's not reflected in-game. Pizza sword. Questionable chain. Shamrock and Ladybug. So many plates. And what's that? Combat heals, bro!
So what sets this kid apart from Marsh? Well, Marsh apologizes for saying slurs, and Luso really puts his back into it. He might come from a weird parental situation, but he's got friends, he's doing cleanup for tardiness. There's not a lot going on with the character, and that's what the game's selling. Not some tale of escapism or anything. Luso goes to a fantasy world by some improbable means and has a fun adventure. Doesn't even really want to go back, just pops in, signs up with a clan, adventure. And I have to stress the story's intentions here, because the ancient magical wizard tells him the trick to going home is filling up his magic book, which self-writes journal entries when he goes out and experiences things. Well, that's a good thing, because I'm not sure this kid is really past functionally literate. Man, he even has the plot's blessing to screw around in Fantasyland. Look, it really is fine. It's fine. But the pedigree! So adventure it is. Like before, you're building a clan, completing quests, and leveling up. But there's a few other things going on. Things like clan territory and the auction house that you don't need to engage with, but can grant minute bonuses here and there. You can collect clan titles that confer abilities and other nerdy garbage no one cares about. What's really going on is the player is weaker than the previous games out of the box, significantly so, and to power up to an acceptable level, you gotta do a lot of footwork on every major front of the RPG. Trying to run the game straight will run you straight into a brick wall. It's sneaky about it. Let's get into how. People have called me crazy about this, but the basics of combat have changed enough in ways that look good, but amount to a gameplay deep freeze. In the other games, attack damage didn't fluctuate too much, if at all, depending on the angle of your attack. Only the accuracy of the attack. FFTA 2 said, well, that's stupid, and altered the mechanics so you do extra damage from behind, about half from the front, and normal damage from the sides. Everything has a bigger health pool than the previous game. What ends up happening throughout the early game is the player gets stuck wading through these extremely muddy, dragged out, low damage battles against a bunch of boring enemies, or generic monsters, on an already slow system. And that's to say nothing of the mana recharge thing, like, used to have all your mana up front, now it just slowly trickles in at 10 per turn. So hold the nuke, chum. I frequently sped the game up via unknown means to get it functioning at an acceptable level. It's so slow it hurts, especially because only one of 4 attack angles yields reasonable damage. Good way to make low damage bows effective though, I guess. Beyond that, mastering abilities is noticeably slower, and to speed it up you've got to make it through a certain point of the game. Here's something good. This title is head and shoulders above its predecessors in available races, jobs, viable class combos, interesting abilities, etc. Though it's less wacky than, you know, ignoring terrain, and I'd rather play with FFT builds, but there's still a lot here either way. It's full of so much cool stuff, so much charm, beautiful effects, the works, but the absolute swamp your average player has to trudge through to reach the payoff is so mind-bogglingly deep and rancid that I insist you play the PC version, and insist on cheating if necessary. In the old days, coming home and playing it during free time in high school was fine, but man, I got things to do. I can't be wasting 3 hours of my day trying to master Thundaga, you feel me? The early game for me really culminated in this one small battle. It wasn't even a story mission, and it took 44 in-game minutes for an early skirmish. Because the enemies were competitive with my level, my gear was average, and the enemy damage sponge parked himself on the one path up, facing forward for that half damage, and my jump number was low, no way around it. It only ended because I got lucky with a few sleep spells and managed to chunk down the remaining enemies, but for the love of God. And I lost a couple units. That's the trick. It wasn't mind-numbingly slow and boring. It was mind-numbingly slow and boring and dangerous. They could deal damage, had ranged attacks. It was the grindiest thing I experienced the whole game. And it almost captured that feeling FFT did so often, putting the fear of God into me. But instead of taking 15 minutes, Well, and all of that crap fades by endgame. There's so many fun ways to break the game over your knee and just start nuking guys. It's almost a sad fate for the one installment where status ailments consistently work and are often better than just chunking dudes. Sad for a game with so many utility moves. Naturally, gotta hand it to the Ranger. I used to think, ew. Okay, that's not cool. Nice poker, Hambo. But oh no, he can turn an X potion into 400 damage, the strongest, most reliable nuke that early in the game. Turns encounters into a snap. Cheesy? Yes. Necessary for time. On that note, even with nukes, the level design tends to play more of a role in this installment than the previous game, anyway. Mountainous terrain can make for interesting battles with restricted paths, even if they drag a bit with low move and low jump. Did that bishop just jump down into an invisible trap and get charmed? What the hell is this game? FFTA barely cared about its environment. There were so many flat plains and nothing levels, and while FFT did, it was mostly early on, when you and the enemies were closer in power level, enough that tactical terrain use was a factor. At least this one sometimes presents a challenge. And I do mean this unironically. The old, it's good if you spend the 20 hours to get into it, because it has so many things to do. So many challenges, lots of post-game content for the truly interested, and the classes have never been cooler. I mean, it fumbles in all kinds of ways. This one Moogle class is straight garbage, and plenty just suck outright, but it's probably the ultimate optimizable Final Fantasy Tactics game if you're a high power level min-maxer. But that's nerdier than this show likes to get, and the law system changed enough for the better, I think, that it deserves a few words. You can't go to jail for breaking the law, you just lose your judge's protection and any bonuses selected at the start of the fight. Furthermore, you can't revive any units that die after the law is broken. It's mostly disadvantageous to break the law, but it gives you flexibility if you think you can handle a battle without those protections. Sometimes the laws are just outright stupid, like no attacking lower level units. Weird choice in a game that loves grinding. Actually, there's a whole host of ridiculous laws that aren't random, at least in story missions, and the idea is, along with the geographical considerations, that the game is designed a lot more deliberately than before. And it can be. But it really isn't either. Here's an integrated gameplay/story critique. Very little about FFTA 2 has any weight to it. Like, occasionally you might sympathize with the character's struggles, but not too much, nothing compared to the other games. So when cutscenes involving assassins and a criminal organization crop up, you'd think the game was turning mature, but no. Oh no, any political thing is spoken of in the vaguest terms possible. The villain isn't motivated by anything interesting like that, and instead of having some high-stakes battles against these chuckle funds, you get a flat battlefield where the gunman runs headlong into his very timely demise.
This really is like FFT, holy crap!
In fact, most of the story missions feel disconnected and get gummed up by a ton of add-on characters that, I mean, why does Al Cid even exist? We already have a Cid. Go home. Vaughn and Penelo are here for some reason, and they're important, maybe. You know, I beat this a couple weeks ago, and I have no idea why they're here. It's a very forgettable story. It's not a tangle of sophistication. It doesn't pose a question. There is no inquiry. It's friends good. Decent message. But the pedigree! Though I do appreciate Luso when he's not choking on adventure, constantly screwing with the prissy thief character of superhuman talent, whose backstory is dead parents and I hated being better at everything than everybody. Really? Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe you could channel some of your talent into improving the world. Yeah, I didn't think so. Too busy stealing from people. It's a game to feel mixed on. I mean, the villain has a great design, but her motivation can be chalked up to, I'm the hero of the story, even though I do functionally bad things, because I'm better than other people, and I have a book. You also have a book, so when I kill you and break your book, my story will be complete. Go away. The ending doesn't really deserve comment either. Luso came, saw, learned, went home. He didn't need to overcome some awful character flaw. He just saved the fantasy world, but we already knew what we signed up for. Final Fantasy's in the title. FFTA 2 has great ideas, sometimes great combat, sometimes great additions, a weaker story, and an Everest climb to get the good stuff. The people who pay their dues will have him returned with interest. Everyone else doesn't bother, or leaves before ever knowing the highs. It's the tragedy of the game. Final Fantasy Tactics was razor sharp, and while grinding was annoying, its totality was masterful. It's the game that could entertain openly bad design in a few key places, and sit at the top of the mountain regardless. FFT cut deep and fast. The sequels burn low and long, and nowadays they're practically embers. They all have some value. I'm not here to sneer like a bygone-era cynic. Still, there's fan interest. These games aren't without love, but it's pretty apparent where the series high was, what struck the most resonant chord, and it feels every year like we lose a bit of relevance. I'm a huge fan of this series. I want to scream about it till my throat's raw. I want to see a game hit that hard again, be as remarkable again. But you know, for games measured in pixels and squares, nobody really seems to care.
Hey, it's KBash. Special thanks goes out to my $4 patrons, whose names are on the screen. The show's on its way somewhere good thanks to the community's generosity. And special thanks goes out to my extra generous patrons who are...
Andy Blarg,
Azero,
Basement Dweller,
Beverage Crisp, Boha, Brandon,
Brios,
Cal,
can I cuss on here?
Caesar T,
Cordant, Chris A,
Cody Golden, Corgi the Lad,
Couch MOBA, CW Glassworks,
Kyle Lapreed,
Daddy Dagoth,
Dakota Storm Jones,
Dondium, Danky Stank Swanky Make,
Dara, David Castillo, Den Het, Dylan Coffee,
Annex, Aesthetico,
Exa, Frankenstitch,
Glyph Seeker, Guard Corey, Gucci Plant, Hatsune Miku's Crack House,
Harkaj,
Heeman Gamin Station,
Huey,
Ingenious Clown, Irradiated Cherries, Ice Kyle,
Jason Lasky, Jaden, J-Daz, John Weber, Joke Frog,
Keegan Too Cool, Keith Myers, Clocked, Creighton, Crazy Dark Chocolate,
Latrix, Laundry Mom, Lego Sid,
Lon, Magical Madman,
Markules,
Maximilian Wolfgang Niver,
Milky Moo Official,
Mitchellanius, Mr. Dodongo, Nito Torpedo,
Old Burgle,
Old Man Cranberry, Only LK, Pink Peacock, Quasar McDougal, Quinn, Reasonable Willow,
Reggie Rodriguez,
Ricochet Frame, Sagitrash, Siren Smells Good,
Salty Smasher,
Sekai no Awarida,
Shod, Simp God,
Slagathor, Sleepy Wabbit, Special Children, Spooky Grimalkin, Squishword, Sublime Cataclysm, Super Katsanova,
Super Sandwich Guy,
TFY Lex, The Big Bubby, The Salt Knight, They Call Me Gambit,
Thrips Heartrop,
Travis Edwards, Twiddle Chungus,
V01156, Venom,
Vice Pup, Viewers Like You,
Vic, Walter Taggart,
Waposa, Weeb Trash,
Well Shit,
Yay Kundo,
Zachary V,
Zanaso,
Zane the Impure, Zane the Pure,
Zed Slayer Gamer.
If you'd like to help support the show and make it even better, check out my Patreon. We've got all kinds of goals and lots of rewards in store. Stay tuned for more. KBash out.